Good evening. Welcome back to the second session of Satan in Judaism. It is Thursday evening, February 13th, and all of you have come back, and we'll see if those who aren't here at the moment make their way back or not. I don't think, looking around the room, that anybody is here for the first time. That is, everybody who's here, I believe, was here last Thursday, if that is correct.
Not correct.
Oh, you weren't here, Jane.
I wasn't there.
Thank you. I just expect you to be everywhere, so I forgot. So glad you're here.
2 seats. Oh, well, anyway.
I want to show everybody that all the information for this class is being updated to the Shalom website. Not fancy, but functional. Excuse me. If you click on, it might say menu, or it might have these 3 lines in the top left, depending on what you're viewing, orshalom.org. Under education, the bottom one is Satan in Judaism with Rabbi Meltzer. I felt it necessary to add that because somehow it felt weird writing Satan on our website. So I had to qualify it that he's under my supervision, so it will be acceptable. And then there on that page, well, maybe it is the rain, or maybe Satan's unhappy. See what happens. There we go. Is this sheet? I don't know why on my, it must be in the style sheet of our website. The ones that have active links should be a different color or underlined, and they're not. So I've appended click here for those that already have the active links. So that way you know. So the source sheet from last Thursday is here. The source sheet for tonight is here. And the recording from last Thursday is up here on YouTube. You can click on it if you want to go back and watch it with some very, very mild editing. And, you know, I will get tonight's up there as well. And we'll see how early I can get up the source sheet for next Thursday. Part of the problem with getting up the source sheet ahead of time is there's a certain amount of in development in terms of what we cover from night to night and how far we get and so forth. And you'll see that when we turn to tonight. Last week we looked at Satan in the Tanakh, except for the book of Job. We even looked a little bit at the Zechariah chapter 3 text. And I gave you a little bit of homework for those who were interested. A little bit of obtuse homework because it only works if you know the book of Job. But we don't have time to do everything. You should only know, in between classes every week, my sources grow and grow and grow. I found some earlier stuff that I'm excited about that we're not going to cover. So maybe at some point we'll talk about the stuff that we're not going to do. Did anybody do the homework? That is, I put here 3 Psalms, Psalm 38, Psalm 71, and especially Psalm 109, which actually 4 times uses the sin, tet, nun, the Satan word, 3 times as a verb and once as a noun. Anybody take a look at the Psalms? Okay. Briefly. So they'll make more sense maybe after tonight. So I've appended those 3 Psalms to, and on accident I included the Zechariah text too. I didn't really mean to do that. So they're on this week's handout also. I don't think I'm going to refer to them, but you never really know for sure. And but they're there. After tonight talking about Job, we will maybe we'll talk about them, but you can look at them and I'm happy to talk about them between now and next Thursday or next Thursday. How many people have some acquaintance with the book of Job? So I'm in the spot that the only way to understand what Satan does in Job, or the Satan, or the adversary, or the whole thing that we're talking about, is to understand the book of Job. So we're going to have to hopefully not take a whole hour, but take some time. The big problem, and in fact, it's the big problem that all of this literature now is going to confront, and only a piece of it from last week is true, is that the world doesn't always go the way we want it to go. And sometimes the world can seem downright unfair or unjust. Now, to the atheist, get over it. It's not a problem. I mean, it's a problem. It stinks when the world is unjust. But if you have no preconceived notions about how the world is supposed to operate, then you have no basis for complaints and no deep existential problems. If all of a sudden we all expect gravity to work, if gravity stopped working, you could have a legitimate complaint. But only people with some either naivete or perhaps a theological belief have a sense that the world is fair. And on some level, when we come up against injustice or corruption, or bad people that control us, or just bad luck, then it's bad people or bad luck. And, we sort of have to suck it up for whatever it is, or fight against it if it's bad people, or. The problem is once we develop a vision of the world that imposes upon it some level of expectation. Once we think that the world is created and governed by a very powerful or all-powerful, just God, we have a problem, right? If it's just random mutations, some people didn't do so well in the cosmic lottery, and your parents who loved you gave you crappy health genes. They didn't do it on purpose. They had no choice. That's the way it works. Some people, it's not even their parents' fault, so to speak. Random mutations happen in our genetic code, and there's a whole system of how the system's supposed to correct it, and it doesn't always work. So, stinks. We should be funding medical research. We should be taking care of and compassionate towards those who are sick, and that's what it is. But if you believe that there is a just and powerful, all-powerful God who's looking out for us, then it's no longer a random mutation or just your genetic heritage. Then it's a problem that God either caused or let happen. Say it again. Something that happens that we don't expect or we don't like. If we have a theology of a God who is good, and a God who has the power to act, then why didn't God fix this? Or why did God allow this to happen? Or why did God cause this? Right, I got three possible beefs with my imagined powerful or all-powerful, all-good deity. It's not that challenge isn't new. Our earliest clear references to it are in Greek philosophy. In Old Greek, we would talk about theodike. In modern English, we talk about theodicy. The challenge of, is God just? Theo being God, and dike, the root that we still take justice and judicial and so forth from. And again, all from the premise, if God is in charge, and God has power to act, and we know God to be good, then bad things shouldn't happen, right? With a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, God should swerve the drunk driver away from my little kitten who got out of the house. I don't even like using examples that are more tragic than that, right? We could argue about what would be justice to happen to the drunk driver once God diverts the car, but whatever the drunk driver would have hit other than, herself is fundamentally unjust. And if God's hand is truly powerful and God is good, then it won't happen, right? God would protect the vulnerable, the righteous, And the world just doesn't seem to happen that way, and it's a problem. Now, why is it only a problem when we get to the youngest or newest or last written books of the Bible? And the answer is most of the Bible doesn't think that God makes the whole world fair like that. Most of the Bible isn't predicated that God makes it so that the righteous people who do what God wants live long, healthy, wealthy, happy lives, right? Most of the Bible doesn't have that. The clear exception to that is probably the book of Proverbs. And okay, so you have the book of Proverbs, but you got all the rest of the Bible that sometimes bad people are punished, though it's usually in the collective. And more often than not, why did why were our ancestors slaves for 400 or 430 years in Egypt? I don't know. The Bible doesn't tell me why it happened. It tells me as part of the promise to Abraham. God tells Abraham it's going to happen, but God doesn't say they're going to be bad and deserve it. Some of the bad things that happen, God says, they're going to be bad and deserve it, but that's always in the collective. And this idea that the world should be fair, and if I work hard, I should get the highest grade in the class, or the biggest paycheck, or if I exercise and eat my carrots, I should be guaranteed a long, healthy life, or. It's not promised in the tradition until some people invented the idea that God should work that way. Now, by the way, it doesn't work, and that's going to ultimately lead to the co-option of afterlife theology. All right, they're going to look to the Zoroastrians at first, then develop their own system, because the beautiful thing about afterlife theology is it makes the world totally fair in the absence of any evidence. Right? I have empirical evidence that the world isn't fair. I know some really good people who seem to have gotten the short end of the stick. But if I believe the right way, I'm not worried about it because they will get their just deserves in the next world. And I know some crummy human beings that seem to be flying high in this lifetime. And don't worry about it because in the next world, they're going to get their just deserts also. Afterlife theology is perfect, because everything becomes fair and good, and you don't need any proof for it. You just got to believe in it. But the rest of the world doesn't function. This world doesn't function that way. So the book of Job is written in exactly that moment where our ancestors have become wise enough to acknowledge an injustice. We want the world to be fair. We want God to look out for the righteous and God to at least protect us from the wicked, if not to actually slap them on the wrist or spank them or do whatever would be the just thing to do for the wicked. And the world doesn't work that way. I don't know why, right? I don't know why. And so we have a couple of responses to that question. The book of Ecclesiastes is one struggling with that question, but that's topic for another night or another season. We'll come back to the book of Ecclesiastes on Sukkot. So we'll get there. And the development of Satan is the development of a new character into the overall nature of the world equation that is a corrective factor that is not as cool as the afterlife, but Satan becomes an element of storytelling that allows us to maintain a sense of justice in the world, maybe. In the book of Job, more so than in Zechariah, because Zechariah it's more obtuse and a little reference and all the rest, is exactly that. It is using Satan as a character to maybe help rescue a sense of justice in this world. End of chapter 1, not of the book of Job, of the book of Scott for tonight. Are we good so far by way of introduction? Now, the story of Job that we have in our Bible, I meant to double check. I think it's 42 chapters. Since this is being recorded, it's important that I'm correct. I will look it up real fast. And I will say that I am correct. It is 42 chapters. It is a retelling of an older story. Okay? The older story is a very short book. We have hints at it, but we don't have it extant, so we have to imagine that it existed. It has a different life in Christianity. Again, the book of Job is in the Christian Old Testament and whatnot, but the older version of the Job fable, fairy tale, is remembered in Christianity through St. James, and in a different issue, not our topic for tonight. What's that story? That story is the story of a righteous individual, somebody who did everything right, crossed all their T's and dotted their I's, who suffered horrifically and never cried out and say, poor me, woe is me, where's God, this is unfair, but remained faithful and loyal to God. And in the end, God restores to them all that they had lost. Okay, that is where we get the tradition of patient Job that is remembered by St. James, again, somebody else's tradition. We have it as kind of it's not really bookends, because bookends aren't a book. We have it by way of the introduction and the conclusion of the book of Job, and we'll take a look at both of those. But that would be all of chapter 1, half of chapter 2, and picking up in chapter 42. Okay? So that is a little under 5% of the book of Job. So when anybody talks to you about patient Job or whatnot, they're talking about less than 5% of the book. It's okay. I have plenty of students who only read the beginning and read the end, and they think they know what the book is about. The book of Job, from the middle of chapter 22 until late in the book, not quite the ending, is about Job complaining that Job doesn't deserve to be treated the way Job is being treated. Now, that fundamentally is not what we call patient. Screaming, this isn't fair, and complaining that it's not getting better, we don't tend to call that patient. So everybody who says patient Job is reading less than 5% of the book and letting it be. Now, the most interesting part for me is we know that Job is correct. I often hear people saying, this is unfair. And I want to say, you didn't tie your shoelace, and I told you to, and then you tripped on it. Stop whining. Or, some other, you left the door open and the dog got out. They're like, I can explain sometimes why bad things happen. Don't whine about it. But Job, as we'll see in a minute, has none of that. Job, we're told, is like the cream of the crop of righteousness. And we know why Job suffers, right? We don't usually know why people suffer, but we know why Job suffers, and it's not because he deserves it. He doesn't deserve it. So all throughout, from the middle of chapter 22 to chapter 39, I think, and every time Job says, I don't deserve this, the reader of the book knows he does not deserve it. Okay, we're going to look at that in chapter 1. And all of those, 38 chapters, 37 and a half chapters in the intermediate of the book, which is the vast majority of the book, is a series of conversations with 4 friends who, when they first show up, are really nice friends. They come for the Shiva visit. They don't speak to him as you're supposed to do. They sit with him. I imagine they bring food for him. I would say they bring brownies, but they're not really Ashkenazi, so they probably bring like salted nuts and dried fruits and the other traditional foods that Sephardim or Mizrahi Jews bring to a Shiva house because they're Mizrahi. And then after that lasts for just 2 verses, then they start saying to Job, if God is punishing you, it must be your fault. You must deserve this. And we know that they're wrong. And Job knows that they're crappy friends. And so the book, it's interesting. It deserves to be read in detail, deserves to go through each of the argument of the 4 friends. There's more in the historical space. But the fundamental reality is we know that each friend is wrong. These are in a tragic personifying of Job's friends are that whole logic of something bad happened, check the mezuzah scrolls. right? If there's a plague on the house, they probably didn't, check their mezuzah scrolls. Or I told him he should have kept kosher. So when the tree fell on his house, that's why, he never kept kosher in spite of the fact, or the people who want to make the world just by saying you deserve the bad fate that happened to you. That's what Job's friends say in a variety of different ways. And we know they're wrong. Book says Job is without fault. And then the most challenging part of the book, which I think is very important to the Satan discussion, is at the end of the book, one of the things that Job says, look, God is like the Supreme Court in one chair, right? You can disagree with the court, but there's no overruling the court unless the court does it itself. That is the highest of authorities under American law, no matter how much you complain or whatever. So a little bit of license. Job says, I get it, right? God is the ultimate decisor. God does what God does. I understand. But first he says, if there could be a judge, if we would agree to an impartial judge or an impartial panel, I would win. I would be vindicated, right? God would lose. And the coolest thing is we know Job is right. We know that Job doesn't deserve this. And like Job, we know that there's no higher authority, to paraphrase the Hebrew National commercial, right? God's will is God's will. You can complain, you can fight it. And Job understands that even if he could convince God to show up in the courtroom, right? There's no judge who has authority over God. But if there was, Job would win. I love that because it's true. The book tells us it's true. And then Job says, you know what? And this is getting late into the 30s. Job says, all right, this all stinks. And we'll see, we're going to look at chapters 1 and chapter 2. We're not talking about little things. No disrespect if your kitten gets out of the house or whatnot. Amongst life's most horrific suffering is Job. Job says, at least if God would appear before me, right? At least if I knew I wasn't suffering alone. At least if God would come directly, instead of just sending misfortune towards me, I would take comfort in that. And then when God appears, God is everything except for comforting. Who is this that dare darkens counsel? Were you there when I stretched out, when I sported with Leviathan and God comes as big and powerful and says, close your mouth, you know not of what you speak. God says, I am mighty, you are puny. Which is not really the comfort I think that Job is going for, right? I mean, God could come without having a need to vindicate God's self and just make an appearance, and Job would have some comfort in that. But God comes in the whirlwind, as the storm, as the tempest, and says, I am big and powerful, and you are whiny, and nobody likes whiny. And in the end, it's a great line. It's not necessarily our focus, but Job says, before I heard of you with the hearing of the ear, something like I only knew you by rumors. Now I know you by the seeing of the eye. Now I know what you are really like, O master of the universe. Therefore, Job repents from everything that he says and doesn't speak again, which some people take to be righteousness. You can read it at the beginning of chapter 42. I take it to be surrender. I take it to be surrender against the forces of the universe. And then we get to the end. It's interesting. We have older versions where Job gets his old kids back. It's a resurrection story, one of our earliest resurrection stories. So the author of the book of Job wasn't willing to go to the resurrection space just yet. Resurrection will come into Judaism, but not till the book of Daniel. Didn't make it in the book of Job. And there are lots of problems with Job getting new children. I mean, there are lots of problems in general. Right? Job's children are objects for his punishment. They stay dead. And new kids are wonderful, but new kids aren't the old kids for those who have lost a child and go on to have additional, but whatever. That's the overall piece of the book. And I think that it's critically important to the understanding of the book, the role that Sataan, the adversary, the Satan, this character that we're going to talk about now, I think his role is critical to understanding the book because it changes the presence of the Satan, the adversary in this book, changes the nature of God, the role of God, the function of God. Right? I could tell this whole book exactly the same way and take out Satan from chapter 1, or the Satan from chapter 1 and chapter 2, and I think the book would be very, very different. And that's what I want us to focus on as we try to understand what is the nature of this character called Hasatan. End of chapter 2. How are we doing? All right. Now a little bit about language. Ooh, my computer raised my hand. I have to turn off that automatic setting. The Hebrew, and I didn't make it red. Ooh, I should make it red. So he appears a couple times in chapter 1 and chapter 2. I'll at least do the ones to show it. Here, and we talked a little bit about it. I didn't make a big fuss about it. It has the noun marker, the direct object marker of Hasatan, the Satan. We looked at last week how that word means conflict, obstruct, something along those lines, maybe with violence. I mentioned it. We didn't look at that article. Here it seems to be the title of a character who is going to come before God and talk about Job. I don't really want to read all 22 verses of chapter 1. I don't mean I want one of you to read it instead. I mean, I'm going to go through it. You can tune me out for a minute if you want to read all 22 verses more carefully. Again, if you go to orshalom.org, education, Satan and Judaism with Rabbi Meltzer, you can, this is session 2, you can put the source sheet on your own computer, or you can open any Tanakh, any Bible that you have, and almost at the very end of the Bible, you can find the book of Job and have that there. But I'm not going to read the whole thing, okay? But I want to be interrupted. I've now spoken for 30 minutes. I want to be interrupted either with questions or comments or just to tell me to slow down if I'm reading the chapter too quickly. I'm going to go through kind of the highlights for what I think are the critical elements that I want to highlight. I'm not going to worry about his name or where he comes from. Verse 1, blameless and upright, feared God and shunned evil. In the context of the religious world in general, the Bible in particular, that's not a bad nom de guerre, right? To be blameless, upright, fear God, and shun evil. I can't imagine anybody's going to say that or write that on my tombstone, but that's an awfully lovely epitaph for a human being. And he lives in a world of abundance and plenty. So that is, maybe his righteousness is rewarded. That'll be a question. But he had, 10 kids, more boys than girls. That's a blessing in the Bible world. He was really wealthy. He had a whole lot of animals in a very large household, wealthier than anybody else. Okay? Only did good, lots of rewards. He was so righteous and cautious that when his kids would have parties, they would have parties and they would eat and drink and do whatever. Verse 5, when their parties were over, Daddy would remind them to sanctify themselves, and Daddy would make burnt offerings, one for each of them, because Job was afraid that maybe they got carried away at the party and said something or did something or thought something that wasn't kosher, so to speak. So Job offered sacrifices in the name of his children, so that even though I'm sure his kids were good, to create kind of to extend his force field of protection, to protect his kids through his own righteousness. Good. Another side note, that could be a whole other series about the question of parental righteousness protecting children and parental sins punishing children. Cool biblical theme that's referenced here because we have an explained example about how righteous daddy is able to extend the protection of his righteousness over his children, even though they're not living in his house. They're having parties in their own homes. Maria.
Living a life of righteousness, can that also be a sign of living in fear, of never making a mistake?
So two answers. One is idiomatically they go together, but not just any fear, but fear of heaven or awe of heaven. Now, what that actually means, I don't know. I'm not going to go there tonight. That would be another series. It's an important theological construct biblically and in rabbinic Judaism. But righteousness and fear of God or fear of heaven go hand in hand. And whether or not that would make one cautious, yeah, I think there's, in some ways, for some people in the relationship between that kind of fear and maybe conservative, with that kind of, maybe could be explored. Yep. Now, verse 6. Verse 6 creates or reflects this mythological idea, it's tax season, that there is a time when all of the heavenly bodies, the angels, those who serve God, the celestial beings, pick your word. If you want to, I can show you right here. They are called B'nai HaElohim, which again, language is fun. Some people want to play off of that as God's children, but like God's divine children, look at Genesis chapter 6, so forth. I think the best reading of B'nai HaElohim is exactly that, is the other celestial beings, those who are part of God's household. Again, God's household is very large. The celestials, something good like that. So when they all came before God, and this one called Satan, the Satan, the Satan, the adversary, I'm okay with all of those in this context, is with them. He's one of the divine beings, and God signals out the Satan and says, "You're always bad-mouthing all of my creatures who I love so dearly. But have you seen?" First, God says, "Where have you been? I haven't seen you up here on top of the mountains or riding the clouds or wherever exactly we are in a long time." And the Satan says, "I've been roaming all over the earth." And then God says, "You're always telling me the bad things that people do. But have you seen Job? You got nothing not nice to say about Job." So already let's acknowledge that Satan has his place in that world. Satan is worthy of a conversation with God. God cares about Satan's opinion, right? One of the troubling pieces of this text for me is God cares about what the adversary says. God takes him seriously. Now, if we understand that the reason why the Satan has been roaming around the earth, and the reason why God highlights beautiful Job is that Satan's job is to kind of rat all of us out to God. That God's not watching to make that list and to check it twice. The Satan is watching, so that when you do something bad, he's got it in his book. And so he can come up to God and say, "Whoo-hoo, did you see when Scott yelled at his kids for no reason?" And whatever the dirt is. And God takes him seriously, right? So much so that God seems to have a certain sense of joy or pride that, all right, there weren't 8 billion back then, but however many people there were, God's got one One, to say, I bet you have nothing not nice to say about Job. All right. A number of pieces there, but I'm struck that what the Satan says to God matters to God in this narrative. And God says he's the best, blameless and upright, fears me and shuns evil, which is exactly what the narrator said, half dozen verses up above. So God agrees with the narrator, the storyteller, that Job is blameless and upright, fearing God and shunning evil. And so, what should the adversary say at that point? If we give nobility of character to the one whose job it is to find dirt on all human beings, what should be the response? I'm going to knock the Satan and I'm going to knock God in another verse or two. What should the Satan's response be? Crickets. No, yeah.
It seems in the old tradition, at least that there's something blasphemous about arguing with God about God's judgment, but I don't know.
So the neat thing is, God's not offended that the adversary pushes him.
I'll hang out with you if you're gonna eat more.
Oh, that's Walker. I'm like, what voice is that?
Sorry. I
That's
was going
funny.
to say,
Yeah.
you picked that up on my headphones. Wow. And I'm jumping ahead a slight bit,
That's okay.
but Satan doesn't contradict God. He doesn't say that you're wrong, right? He just says, well, you made it so easy for him,
Good.
right?
Right. But
He's
my
not-
question is, well, I'll just say it then, rather than asking it. There's a nobility of character. There's a system reflected in this story. God takes care of those who are righteous. And that's the way in the worldview and the cosmology present here, that's the way the world's supposed to work. Right? So the seems to me that the adversary should say, you're right. You know what? I have a long list of every other human being on earth. And this one, I got nothing bad to say about him. That strikes me as the virtuous response by the adversary, which is not what he says.
But okay, so these are the divine beings, right? These are the beings with no free will, right? The whole point of humans, as I understand it, was that we have choices of free will. And I detect jealousy in these sentences. Like, it sounds like jealous kids, like going, well, of course everything is good with that favorite kid, right? You've given him everything.
Nice. And in fact, the issue of angels being jealous of human being is an issue in the Midrash and related to Satan, right? And picked up not only in Jewish Satan, but elsewhere as well. I just like the idea of, Satan has another response option to say, you're right. And you know what it's like? The prosecutor shouldn't be gleeful that for all of the dirt, the district attorney should be happy to come across people who are innocent. Somebody files a claim, something, and you look into it and say, nope, this person is good and clean in the language of Job, blameless and upright, fears God and shuns. But that's exactly not what the adversary says. The adversary, as Allison points out, says, well, of course he kisses up to you incessantly, because you always make him front of the line and bathroom monitor, and he gets the first scoop of ice cream. And of course that kid behaves right. That kid's smart enough to know how to work the system. So on the one hand, he's got to kiss up in the right moments, and he can't, but boy, does he get well rewarded. Now, I have a question. What text, biblical or otherwise, condemns the person who's smart enough to kiss up to God? I got, you should love the Lord your God with all your heart. Okay, fine. But I can show you a dozen biblical passages where being smart enough to work the system is considered virtue. So even if the Satan is right about Job, I don't know that he is. I don't think that he is. But even if he is, what's wrong with that system? Where does it say, thou shalt offer all of these sacrifices and you will be forgiven and the land will know peace? But if you do it because you want the good that comes from doing it, then it won't count. Alan?
Your prosecutor line is stuck in my head. If I think of
Sorry,
Satan as a
counselor?
right? But if I think of Satan as a prosecutor, right? And that Satan has been on earth. That's what he just says. I'm in earth. I've been roaming around. I've been checking out everybody. Like, he's seeing some of the worst of humanity. And why maybe my jealousy before is different. It's more of a gatedness. Like, I've seen all these humans. They all mess up. This one you just treat nicer.
Yeah, but this one didn't mess up. Be
Right.
careful. I'll agree with you up to a point. Right? Jaded, I like that image. That's like, oh, there's got to be something wrong with this one because none of them can be that good because I've seen all of them. Yeah, Lynn?
Well, God points him out. He says, wait, check out this. Here's Job living his, keeping under the, he's undercover, living his good, prosperous life. And God points to him and says, yeah, check this one out. It's kind of unfair to begin with.
Yeah, we'll talk about one of my favorite rabbinic expressions. I think maybe next week. Again, I haven't totally decided what goes into week 3 and what goes into week 4. But there is an old expression, don't open your mouth to Satan. Al tiftach pe Satan, which I think is already one step removed from here, but God gets Job into trouble. Now, I don't think God does it willfully, right? But it's like if God didn't say, look at the shiny one, maybe the Satan would have complained about Job anyway.
God doesn't do things accidentally. Do you
Says
really
who?
think he kind of just happened to point him out?
So that is a narrative question tied to people's theology. So my answer is yes. In my image, in the narrative, you can ask me about my personal theology. I like the story better if God doesn't know that this is going to happen and this is going to happen, and then Job's 3 friends are going to come, then the 4th friend, the Elihu, is going to come, and then God's going to have to appear in the world, right? I like it better if God is a character in the story and not above reproach and not all-knowing and not. So I like the idea, maybe even that if God was more self-aware, God doesn't seem to me to be self-aware in this book, that God would be like, wait, oh me, damn it. I wish I hadn't pointed the spotlight at my shiny one, because pointing him out makes for a big headache. So I don't think, again, other people, you can read the book differently, and you certainly can have different theologies than I do, but I don't think that God intentionally opens this can of worms and says, I know what's going to happen when I point to Job, that the adversary is going to get jealous and angry. And then I like the story better if God, you get all excited about something and you want to show everybody the excited thing and then doesn't go exactly the way you planned it. I think maybe God has a higher opinion like I want from the adversary, and God expects the adversary to say, you're right, O master of the universe who made 8 billion people, you did get one of them correct, which is not what the adversary says. Yeah, Maria?
But with that, then he would not be an adversary anymore. He would be agreeing with God. And that
So
would
here's the
make
thing.
it
That's
fair.
outstanding. I think that the title here is not as an adversary of God. I think that, and that's why, one of the reasons why we did last week and looked at all the texts that we did, in none of those texts is the word used as somehow standing up in the face of God. I think that the Satan or the adversary is exactly that obstacle or that block or that conflict that gets us punished, right? That's how I understand why the title is applied to this mythological figure or this angel as it's used in this book. That he is the adversary to human beings, but only in the sense of, or the obstacle, only in like, he's what gets us caught all the time and therefore gets us held responsible. That's why I think he's called the adversary or Hasatan. And that's why I think the development of this role. But we'll talk about what it means vis-a-vis God as we move forward a little bit more. So again, you don't have to agree with me.
Rabbi, I'm wondering about the nature of tests, like especially earlier on in the Tanakh. Like, Abraham is also really righteous, and God puts him through a bunch of tests. And Joseph goes through tests, and Jacob goes through tests, and Moses goes through tests. And maybe Satan is suggesting that Job hasn't been tested in the same way.
So, one, we're going to talk about Abe.
Okay.
Two, when I want us to be precise and middak, and if we had more time and I was willing to follow my nose and jump down a bunch of rabbit holes, I would ask the question, who is tested and where are they tested? So Abraham explicitly, it says, V'Elohim nisa et Abraham. It's in the middle of Genesis chapter 22, verse 1. God tested Abraham. So 100%. We'll talk about that in a little bit. I can't pull that verb into the other stories that you reference. So if God does test them, then God does so in the way in which we are exegetical, the way in which we interpret a text and so forth. Now, maybe it is explicit in those other ones, but it doesn't leap to my mind. The Abraham one leaps to my mind. We read it every year, twice a year. Yeah. It's a Rosh Hashanah, and it is, was a couple of weeks ago in November. In what month are we in? In January, probably in January.
November or something.
No, it was probably in early January, maybe December, but here, and I will go ahead. So the Satan says Job knows how to work the system, and because of that, you don't let any bad thing to happen to him. You don't give him a reason to be bad. Now, by the way, I don't know that that's true. Is that a reasonable statement that people who are wealthy and get what they want, that therefore, he may not whine and complain that it's unfair that he doesn't have children or it's unfair that he's impoverished, that God takes some of the potential complaints off the table. But there are plenty of other things that people complain about, even if they are wealthy and have lots of wonderful, healthy children, right? So I don't buy the whole argument by the adversary anyway, but the book seems to. The book doesn't raise my complaint, just like it doesn't offer the Satan a chance to have a different line. And so the Satan says to him, verse 11, you'll see that I'm right. Right? I'll bet you. Lay your hand upon all that he has, and he will surely blaspheme you to your face. Now, what are other possible responses? What God is going to say is, okay, do what you want to, but you can't smack him directly. Yeah, you can burn down everything around him, but you can't touch him directly. Right? God gives the adversary permission, and we'll go on with what the book says. But what are other possible responses that God could say? Crickets. God could say,
he doesn't need to be tested.
Yeah, what? Why do I need to test him? Did you forget who you're talking to? Right? He doesn't need to be tested. I can think of 2 reasons why he needs to be tested. I don't know which one Marvin means. Marvin, do you want to say more, or do you want me to give you 2 reasons why he doesn't have to be tested?
Because he's already proven himself to be a good man.
Good. Now I got 3 reasons, because I wasn't even thinking of that. He has a lifetime of good deeds. Now you're going to test him? 1. 2, God says, do you forget that I am God? But do you think I'm going to be surprised? Do I need you to tell me who's going to win the World Series in 2025? Do I need to wait till October to know? Who are you talking to that I should need to test him or whatever else, or question whether or not. And three, the rules don't say that if you are righteous and God rewards you for being righteous, then maybe God will take back your reward just to see if you really mean it. Where the hell does that come from? Oh, I love the hell reference, right? Where does that come from? Who made that? Oh, the adversary made that up. So I don't like God's response, right? There shouldn't need to be a test. He has a long track record. He's got 10 grown children, right? In their world, he's got to at least be in his 30s. Yeah, Jonah?
If we're assuming that God knows that Job will behave correctly, doesn't that take away his free will?
So I don't know if I should assume that God knows the answer to this. I was the one who said before to Lynn's comment about, I like the image that God doesn't know the end of the book at the beginning of the book. Okay? So you're right, that depending on which rewrite I would give to God when I change the script, it absolutely affects the theology or my image of God. In the same way that the one that's here in the book, I think seems to imply that God doesn't know what's going to happen. God doesn't say, like in the case of hardening Pharaoh's heart, I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and therefore the whole world will know that I am really cool and powerful. God doesn't say, hey, we'll test him, and I know that he will pass the test, and that will somehow make some statement about faithfulness. God seems to take the wager, right? Whether God is confident or not confident, God doesn't seem to know in absolute certainty. Okay, that would be the reading that I would choose, but you could do other ones. Another great point.
Right. For
You
those
know.
of us who believe that God is omniscient, we know that he knows the outcome.
Correct, which doesn't make God's response any better, right? Why
Sure,
should
he
Job
knows how
have
it's
to
all going to
suffer?
work out. He knows that no matter what you throw at him, he's going to stay faithful.
Great. So why does God let Job suffer? I have a big complaint.
Because he has to prove the point.
To whom?
The idea that it's a wager is really interesting to me. So, like, if it's a bet, you get something out of it in the end. So, if God wins the bet with Satan, what does God get out of it?
That's a great question. God gets to be proven right.
Yeah, which
The
seems
system
very
gets to be
human.
proven right. But
Yeah.
I
Oh,
don't
he
like
teaches
this
us.
system.
It's of course that he's teaching us
Yes.
because this is a parable and parables teach us.
Yes. But one of the things that this parable teaches me is that sometimes God fails for what I think is right and just. Yes. So like, there are, I don't know what a really good parallel is in terms of as a parent or as a teacher, but there's a system that seems to be in the background here that God rewards the righteous. So if you're good and God rewards you, how does it make it okay for God to say, well, I'm not going to reward you now just to see what happens? That's messed up. That's fundamentally unjust, unfair, and messed up. I don't like it. Maria, and then Lynn?
But isn't Satan saying that his goodness is based on everything he has? Not
Yes. He's only good because he gets rewarded for good. It's absolutely what Satan is saying. But I want to know what's wrong with that.
what's
And
wrong
who is
because people should be good because they want to be good, not because they have material things or
Why?
ability.
Why? I'm totally comfortable in a world where we all get along because it's in our best interest to get along and not because getting along is a righteous
You're
act.
doing the right thing, of course, doing the right thing, whether you're going to get a, prize or not, which sometimes is really hard, but you do the right thing.
Hey, with the idea that you do the right thing and get a prize. In a world where everybody does the right thing and everybody gets a prize, I'm not unhappy in that world. And I don't know the text here. I know medieval texts that talk about motivations. I know rabbinic texts that say, don't do it just to get. I know a whole lot of post-Job texts that tell me that. But what the hell is wrong with my kids doing their chores because they know they'll get an allowance? Or what's wrong with their learning to say please and thank you because they know it makes mommy and daddy and their grandparents really happy, right? What's wrong that they get all A's because you get 6 Krispy Kreme donuts for 6 A's on your report card for free? As if my kids ever had to buy their own donuts. So I don't really know what the gimmick is for free donuts for my children as a side note, but different biblical text. I don't get it. I don't get it. And one part of the genius of this book, I think, is in it's trying to figure out the justice of the universe and the justice of God. It doesn't fix the problem. Part of what I love about the book is it doesn't work. And I think the authors of the book know that it doesn't work. And I think it's going to get us, and I think that Satan plays a critical role in that, right? Because I am disappointed in God and the justice of the universe. And I wouldn't be if it wasn't for the Satan. If the Satan did say, yeah, you want to bet? Because I want God to say, I don't have to bet. I made the system. I reward Job for his righteousness, and you just a whiny angel. That's what I want God to say. And then the system is holy and righteous and just, and it's still a fairy tale because the world doesn't really work that way. Jonah, and then Maria.
I would say,
And then Allison, and then Lynn.
in all of our literature, it says, if you follow my commandments, you will be rewarded appropriately. So this is really a yanking of the carpet out from under him and negating on the agreement that they've had.
So I agree with you. The caveat that I would do is rather than speaking in kind of an anachronistic moment for all of that, I would acknowledge that this is at the time when, having developed a system of reward and punishment for individuals, they discovered that system doesn't work. Most of the biblical system doesn't have that for individuals. It has it for the nation state. So that when the Assyrians kicked the butt of the 10 tribes of the kingdom of Israel, then the kingdom of Judah had to say, look, they messed up. They did something wrong. It must have been the way they decorated their holy temple at Dan or at Bethel, right? And then when the Babylonians beat up the kingdom of Judah, they said, damn, we must have done something wrong. What was our mistake? Oh, we didn't listen to guys like Isaiah enough. Damn it. Or Jeremiah. They told us what we should have done and we didn't do it, right? So moving from that collective reward and punishment, fast forward 3 or 4 centuries, to an idea of individual reward and punishment, which is a beautiful idea, right? That's the lie we tell our children. If you study really hard, you can get an A on any test, or you can be anything you want to be if you work hard enough, or, cheaters never prosper, or a whole bunch of lies that we say that are important, instructive lies, because they teach our children to work hard and to tell the truth, which are virtues. But that doesn't mean that the nearsighted kid can be an astronaut or a fighter pilot. I'm not resentful of my parents lying to me, or that I could have played in the NFL if I had only tried hard enough. Or, look, the way the system is set up, some people aren't going to be successful in the way we classically define school. I just had a great story from a parent who I said to the parent, your child has blown me away with their intelligence. And this is a child that every school labels as not intelligent because the schools define intelligence in the way that they do. But this child has done something I've never, ever seen a 12-year-old do, ever, right? In terms of a learning thing, boggles my mind. Anyway, so I kind of lost myself. I think I went Jonah, Maria, Allison, Lynn. I'll have to play that back because I'm recording. Oh, yeah, I am recording it, right?
So if God knows the outcome, why have a conversation with somebody that's adversary? Like, it's a waste of time, right? Oh, I'm muted?
Nope, I'm whispering. I don't think God knows the outcome in the story. I think the story is a much better parable or fable or fairy tale. Those are all different things. I think it's much better if God doesn't know the outcome. I'm just not happy with what God does and what God says, right? If God said, look, I know the outcome, but I want it to be a sign for all times, for all peoples, and I'm going to let it happen, then I'm still unhappy. Why did all the firstborn in Egypt have to die? Right? That was totally unnecessary. That was just so people should know that God is great. Yeah, whatever. I'm I'm of the opinion that it's not worth killing all of those firstborns just to make that point. God should have found another way. Get a TikTok account. That seems to be effective, right? So I'm unhappy with God in the entire book of Job. All right, Allison, thank you for your patience. And then Lynn.
So help me out, because I'm forgetting when exactly in our history the book of Job comes from. But as we're praying in some of the Psalms in our prayer books, we have this idea of God being a king, a ruler, right? And what I'm seeing, or what I'm rereading in this, is this like very human ruler who's bored, who's questioning, who's listening to his adversaries in a way that I wouldn't think of a divine. If I were to write now, right, my idea of what God is, it wouldn't be anything close to this. More energy, right? Like nothing so like human feeling in a weird way.
Yeah, you want to assign a great assignment, and I gave you homework and none of you did it. And it didn't even involve writing. So I'm not so hopeful about the assigning of homework in the coming 4 weeks. But you want to do something really fun? Write a serious character analysis of God in the book of Job. And we won't all agree. Again, there's a large measure of subjectivity to it. I have no problem with that. I won't argue that I'm right. I will just tell you mine is fully defensible and I can do it from the whole book. But I don't like the character of God in the book of Job. You know, Jewish God has hundreds of faces. There are some that I like, some that I dislike, and some that I dislike even more than that. And the image of God in Job is powerful and pouty and problematic in all kinds of ways. Because I want this to be a short story. I want the adversary to come and say, hey, he only does it to get rewarded. And I want God to say, oh, if only the rest of them weren't that smart. If only all of them knew how to work the system, then they would all get along. There would be no wars. There would be no idolatry. There would be no conflicts, because they would know if they do what I tell them to do, they get rewarded and life would be peachy keen. But if they did that, they never would have eaten the fruit in the first place. And, so much for my short Bible. Lynn.
Yeah, I have 2 things now. Maybe Allison, you should ask ChatGPT to write a character analysis of God in the book of Job. Maybe that would be interesting to see what they came up with.
Hey, Lynn, before you say
and-
whatever you're gonna say, I just sent Rabbi a request to let AI do an analysis of this meeting.
Yeah,
Right.
I just approved it.
All right. That's great. Yeah, transcribe for AI. My comment was very similar to what Maria and Allison said. There's an interesting balance of power that they're really kind of equals discussing this circumstance, and God gives a lot of credence to what Satan says, and he has an effect every time he says something. God listens to him. For some reason, I was thinking of Othello. Iago keeps telling Othello that his wife is cheating on him. This is and he's, who is he to tell the king? But still, there's a vulnerability there that he just has to check it out, has to see what it is. It's similar there. It's very vulnerable, as somebody else said about God.
All right, I can't see where this moment is. We're somewhere about 65 minutes into the video. I don't have a way to mark the moment, to bookmark this moment, but hold that idea, because that whispering in the ear or just planting a seed that, is again, we can later Satan images easy to identify, but I'm going to show you exactly that Satan who just the right little nudge. It doesn't take much. Satan just pushes a little bit and says, so Job is smart and knows how to work the system. And all of a sudden, all of the rest happens, because rather God could just say, shut up, or God could just say, stop, or God could just say, your job is to find dirt and you didn't find dirt, own it. God could do all of those things. But no, once they got the whisper in the ear, once there's like a doubt, or once there's some piece, that's the theme we're going to come back to in the Talmudic stuff, some of them, and it's really good stuff. And that's a theme that we can point to in a whole lot of other images and whatever else. All right, I think I saw Marvin's hands first. Did you do that on purpose? And then
Yeah,
Devin's hand.
actually, before Lynn had mentioned her idea, I was thinking about the movie Trading Places. I don't know if anybody else has
A
thought,
good bet.
but I've been
Mortimer and
right, whatever his name.
Randolph.
But
I
that
have
whole
my
idea,
Satan whispering in my ear. Mortimer and
that whole
Randolph.
idea about testing somebody and taking everything away, and yeah,
And what were the stakes in that bet? They at least had stakes in that bet.
I think it was $1 or something.
Jen's over here whispering and answering my question. Yeah. So do you want to make more of a comparison, or just that it brings that wager?
I just was thinking about it, and before Lynn said that, so I wanted to add that in.
Hey,
That's all.
and what is
nothing
the Eddie
important.
Murphy character's name?
Eddie Murphy?
The Eddie Murphy character in that movie. I think it's Valentine.
Huh.
Just saying that it's February 13th. Somehow
there
it
you go.
all was
Wow.
meant to be and fits
Wait a
together.
second. You're not telling me tomorrow's Valentine's Day, are you?
I'm giving you a couple hour notice. Amazon does overnight delivery. Don't tell Jen, but her gift's in the closet. I don't know if she's noticed it yet or not, but I bought her a Valentine gift this year. All right, David.
Yeah, first of all, just to restore your faith, I did the homework, but I did the wrong homework. I read the whole book of Job.
How does that restore my faith? But I'm glad you read the book of Job.
Okay, good. I think the conversation is really interesting because it's almost like God is being manipulated by Satan. He's very much a King Lear kind of character, old and not entirely in control of his faculties. And Satan keeps on accusing Job of manipulating the system, but it seems like Satan's manipulating the system, manipulating God's system here. And God doesn't seem to understand because there's some sort of hubris or some sort of maybe some sort of dementia even on God's part.
I like it. I don't know that I would necessarily stand with you here, but we're moving in that direction, right? Because it's the God who should be the protector of the righteous. And now, now like all bets are off. That's like the wrong metaphor, or right? That I do like that. I like that very, very much. Lots of other ideas in my head, but I want to push forward because we're almost done tonight, which is absurd. Maria, did your hand go up again?
Just a quick comment on that comment with Devin. It becomes almost you're humanizing God if he can be manipulated. God is not God. He's like two dudes talking that are just like you and I
Yes.
talking now, which it's
So I would encourage those who would read text with me to be willing, at least in the context of our time of text reading, to let go of whatever our needs are or our assumptions are related to God in the other 99% of our life, right? I think the texts are much more interesting if we don't need to make sure that by the end of the text, God is on a tall white horse with shiny armor protecting the innocent, right? Because I think there are a whole lot of, it's, it is God who wants to wipe us out in the desert, and Moses interceding, saying that would be a bad idea, not in your best interest, saying that. And so I can show you commentators who say that God knows that that's going to happen anyway, and it's really more of a test of Moses or whatever else. And that, what I would call a Frumkeit reading, that kind of apologist reading that says God can only be virtuous. Again, if that's a part of one's faith, then that's a part of one's faith. But in our study time together, I want to allow God to be a much more interesting character in the text of our tradition than, I can do no wrong. Yeah, Jonah?
It almost seems like there's a bit of the Purim story here in Haman advising the king, oh, you got to kill them. You can't trust them. And the king is easily swayed.
Nice. So I started by saying I don't like God as reflected here. David made him into maybe senile, maybe dementia, King Leary, and Jonah just full on made him a Achashverosh. Like Jonah just made him the clueless drunkard, lots of power and whatever else. So we should join you and read all the way to the end of the book, because I really don't like God at the end of the book. Let's see just how damaging we can be if already at the beginning of the book we're already stuff. I'm going to push us ahead because it's 8:15, and with the adversary, verse 12 is going to leave from before God, and using other people as an instrument. Job's children and his animals are all going to be slaughtered. Lots of serious questions there about, the children, the grown children. They're not objects of Job. They're not like his animals. We could make we could be upset that the animals are objectified and used as a way of testing Job, but how much more so his children? That's just fundamentally immoral, even by biblical principles, and get over it. Anyway, verse 16, 17, 18, 19 is telling Job, it takes longer for them to tell Job the bad news than it takes for the bad news to happen. It's kind of an interesting piece there. Verse 20, then Job arose, he did kriya, he tore his clothes, he shaved his head, he threw himself down on the ground. That worship thing is interesting. For the sake of time, we're going to fly past it. And he said, naked came I out of my mother's womb, naked shall I return there. God has given, God has taken away. Blessed be the name of God. A line I use at every funeral, a line I unequivocally love for lots of reasons. This is Job's theology. Terrible. A day that you wouldn't wish upon anybody, all 10 of his kids and all, 300 of his she-asses. Like, we're talking big time. The Lord has given, the Lord has taken away, bless God's name. For all that, this is now the narrator's voice, Job did not sin, nor did he cast reproach on God, which makes Job more righteous than most of us, because we all cast a whole lot of reproach on God getting through chapter 1. Chapter 2 is going to be, chapter 2, this is actually chapter 2. It's nice that I can do like real-time editing. Verses 1 to 10, I think, is the second frame. The same setup, and the Satan comes back before God and says, here, I'll at least make one of the Satans. I'm not going to bother making it red. And says, no, that wasn't really a fair test, because you didn't strike him directly. You only struck his possessions. Now, if I had more time, I would tell you I was probably a rabbi for about 20 years before my father passed away. He made it to 2 services that I conducted in 20 years. Not because he wasn't in the same city where I led services, because he was dozens of times, but my dad was my dad. Whatever else you would say about my dad was my dad. And he was him. And once was in Cleveland, the high holidays and whatever. And it was in the context of a conversation about Job related to the binding of Isaac. And like, it was one of those, for those who can remember, Fast Times at Ridgemont High, trying to call on somebody in the classroom and ignoring one person. And my dad was like the Arnold Horshack, ooh, ooh, ooh. And I didn't want to call on him. Trust me, like, if I could have said, look at the time, services are over, and walked out, I was better. And I called on him, because at some point, it wasn't even like they knew he was my dad, but it was like, how come the rabbinic intern is not calling on that guy who is sitting there so excited to make a comment? And I was all ready to melt and cry and scream and, pout. And my dad's comment, relevant, was that the Bible gets the test wrong. The Bible, forget the animals. The Bible gets the test wrong. That the test of faith of illness versus the test of faith of death of children, here 10 for 10, that the greater test, in my dad's estimation, is the test of chapter 1, the death of his children, not the test of chapter 2, his own illness. Which made me want to say, yeah, that's my dad. He's talking about me, So I can't believe I would ever cast aspersions at my dad. I'm a terrible son. I feel really guilty about it. But it represents, this is a different conversation, a different 5-part series. We've had a fundamental shift because in Job's time and for most of human history, I think it's true that the death of children was less challenging than personal illness. And I don't think that's true today. I think the death of children, God forbid it shouldn't happen to anybody, is a greater test of faith or struggle or challenge than personal illness. You're welcome to disagree with me. I want to go past it for now, but hey, call me later tonight. If I'm still up, I'm happy to talk about it some more. So chapter 2 is the same frame, but this time it's really nasty the way Job gets these boils, these sores that he actually scrapes to try and, like popping a zit. He scrapes it to itch him, and it's gross and miserable, and he's really, really miserable. But, right, because God says to the adversary this time, okay, now you can beat the crap out of Job, but you can't kill him, which is good because, the dead don't complain. That's what it says in Psalms. The living are the ones who complain. So don't kill him, just make him suffer. And then it goes through and explains that. And then in a crazy verse 9, his wife says, I can't believe you stay faithful. It literally says, bless God and die. So there's a whole biblical idiom where the opposite is used because the biblical author couldn't write what the translator has no problem writing, which is blaspheme God and die. But, it's like, I know actors who couldn't be an actor and have to say the line, F you God, which is in the Book of Mormon, not the Book of Mormon, but in the Broadway musical, the Book of Mormon. And so there are actors who wouldn't take that role because they couldn't say that. And so the argument is that the authors or the scribes of Job couldn't write blaspheme God. And so they put a euphemism in there that people know what to do. But our translators don't have the same sense of righteousness. They're totally fine writing blaspheme God. And his wife, and there's a question about the motivation of his wife. I don't want to go there. I'm just going to put it out there and highlight it as to whether or not Job responds poorly to her. Job says, you talk as any shameless woman might talk. He says, oh, dumb broad. That's what he says, which I don't like. I don't like for multiple reasons. But I also think that what she says comes from a place of compassion, though maybe it comes from a place of anger to God. Remember, it's her 10 kids who died too, and she's otherwise irrelevant to this story. So we can talk about a feminist reading of the book of Job. But either way, Job then says this line that has repercussions, ripples, all the way down for the intervening 24 centuries of Jewish history from then until now. Should we accept only good from God and not accept evil? Which I think is one of the deepest questions and maybe a core question of the book, right? Should we, obviously, when good happens, we accept it. No, send it back. I didn't really want to win the lottery. But shouldn't we also, if all things come from God, should we accept bad as well as coming from God? And part of the book, and part of the Satan issue is who really is the source of Job's surus? Well, I think in the book it's ultimately God, right? Not to relieve the Satan of culpability, because he does whisper in God's ear and challenges God and raises the bed, or however we want to frame that. But God's in charge at every moment. There's no moment where God says, no, you can't test Job, and then the Satan goes out and kills his children. No. The adversary is loyal to God, and God sets the parameters. So the bad that happens to Job comes from God. And so when Job's wife says, when Job responds to his wife and says, should we not, if we accept the good, aren't we obligated to also accept the evil? Something along those lines. I think that's one of the deepest statements in the book. Now, Job doesn't stay there for from Job chapter 2, verse 11, all the way through to when he shuts up. He doesn't say, I accept joyfully the afflictions that God sends my way. He says, well, we know to be true that it's unfair. Okay, and so the rest of the book, till the ending, is Job complaining, and he's correct. Now, he may not be correct to be complaining, right? Because according to what he says to his wife, after he makes an offensive misogynistic comment, what he says there is one response to when bad things happen. what he says from 2:11, actually, that's when the friends come and they're quiet. There are a couple of nice verses. But picking up, I think, at verse 15, all the way till he gets quiet in verse 40, is not accepting the evil from the evil as well. It's raging against it. And so we have here, in our last couple of minutes, I want to focus back on Satan. And then I'm going to show you all the other texts that I've given you here, because we're not going to learn them together. Hi, Lillian. I just saw you there. I didn't see you there before. That Satan, like, how would you describe the importance of Satan in this? God wouldn't have done what God did. Job wouldn't have suffered were it not for the adversary, right? I have no sense in the fairy tale world of the opening chapters of Job that God would have just said, hey, you know what would be fun? Let's test Job. I don't see it. But God is the guilty party here, right? So does the Satan make it so it's not God's fault? Nah, it's not God's idea, but God's still implicated in it. So whereas I made the comment comparing the King's passage to the Chronicles passage, that by making Satan the one to have David go do a census and so forth, that it keeps God out of being responsible for that, or something along those lines. Here, I don't think the adversary does that. It's still God's fault. Yeah? But in a world in which God can be unpredictable, or a world in which God doesn't always do what we would want or what we think is just, and it's important, right? It's important for us to keep God happy, because Job kept God happy for a long time, and that was really smart of Job to do that, and it went well for him. But the Satan has just enough of God's ear, just enough influence to make a God who can be unpredictable, or a God who, has a bad day, or a God who, the adversary can be just enough to rile up the wrong side, hear the wrong side of God rather than the wrong side of Job, right? So what he does to Job. So maybe you say that the adversary is the adversary of Job, but I think he does more damage to Job when he talks to God and God gives him permission to do it than when he actually comes and schmeises the kids and gives him this illness and all the rest. Somebody has their hand up. I'm not sure who that is.
Oh, it's me.
Who's me?
My name is Wee.
Oh, we. All right.
A quick question. In the story of Job, is there any time in the Hebrew that God's name is referred as Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, or is it always Elohim?
So as a general rule, the translation of the biblical text that I've given, that's on our website, that's on the handout that I am screen sharing, which is the 1985 Jewish Publication Society of Publication Translation of Tanakh, every time they use capital Lord, that is their English translation or transcription of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, of the proper name of God.
Okay. So what you're saying is in this story where God afflicts Job, God's attribute of mercy kind of shows up also.
Oh, so I would say either yes, but, or but yes, that the association and the identity of that name with being Midat Rachamim, with being the name of mercy, is a later ascription to that name.
Oh, okay.
So when we do the anachronistic Jewish thing, ein mukdam vein meuchar ba'Torah, there's no before or after, it all is just like at the same time, then what you said is 100% kosher. But one of the things that I'm trying to do here, and it's been pretty clean for the first 2 weeks, it won't be so clean next week, is to try and show a chronological development of what started as a place name and a noun and a verb is here in Job, as it was at the end of last class I showed you in Zechariah, is fully personified as, again, it's not a name, it's a title. I think there's something to that acknowledging of the adversary or Hasatan that matters. But because I'm trying to do a historical development, then I'm a little less, excited to agree with you. Okay, though from a classical rabbinic standpoint, maybe one could make that argument. And so, bring it back next week and let's see how much I'm willing to give you for that next week. Other thoughts, now that we've done a chapter and a half of Job, and I've talked about the rest of the book, the adversary doesn't appear at the end of the book. I think in terms of, as the editor or the writing coach, I would kick the draft back and say, I think that for the fullest sense of the narrative, I want Job and God to have a conversation at the end. Okay. And it need not be in the end, right? Because there are two endings. There's the ending of the 39 chapters that have been inserted into the middle of this fairy tale. And then there's the ending of the fairy tale itself. If you want to try and draft what would the adversary look like in chapter 40 or 41, and then what would the adversary look like in chapter 42? What might he say, and so forth? Neat questions. Marvin?
I apologize if I missed it, but in the very beginning, did you say who the adversary is an adversary of?
Oh, I think I may have made a mention to it, but I can't prove it. I think that the adversary is viewed here as a title, as an obstacle or in conflict or an adversary to human beings. I think that as the celestial whose job it is to find our dirt, that it's Satan's fault that we get caught, right? And one of the things that Job now plays with is whether or not it's the Satan's fault that we actually do wrong in the first place, right? The frame of it is the adversary is roaming the earth, making a list and checking it twice, and he's only concerned about the naughty side of things. And that would have been well and good, but God shined the spotlight and said, ha ha, you have nothing bad to say about my perfect child. And then, then the adversary creates a system to see if because of the bet or whispering in God's ear, or because of what the adversary actually does, because God gives him permission to do it, killing the children and the animals and making Job sick and so forth, can the adversary then lead Job to sin? So I think we do have that here, but it's the latter part of it. He's the adversary when he just is the one collecting dirt on every human being.
And eventually you're going to get to John Milton, and we'll be talking.
Well, not in these 5 weeks. So that would be a pretty cool
technique. You promised that.
Did I?
I thought so, but maybe.
All right, maybe I should at least pull out a couple of good. There's a couple of good soliloquies from Satan in Milton's Paradise Lost, and maybe I'll have to sneak those into the.
Because of course, in that isn't Satan or the adversary of God, because he wants to take over.
So if you recall, in the first class, I gave a couple of examples of the biblical passages that later tradition will use to show some of the themes of Satan that we haven't seen yet Jewishly. I'm going to leave as a question mark, but we all know as part of the dominant Christian narrative of Lucifer, like thrown from heaven into the pit for rebelling. So this text from Isaiah doesn't say Satan, but it talks about right here, Hillel ben Shachar. We could also look at the Isaiah text for Ayelet HaShachar, the morning star that is cast into the abyss, which will be the biblical text that we know already that Christian writers are going to pick up on as being important. Ezekiel has a parallel for it, thrown down into the pit and so forth. I thought I had other ones in here too. Did I just have thrown into the pit from heaven? Maybe I just did from last week. So in Milton, we'll have that's going to be a dominant piece. We're going to look at, somebody sent me a chat. Oh, I want to acknowledge in the chat window. I don't know if you can see it when I open the chat window, but you have the chat window that Allison was artificially multitasking. Allison, are you still there? Oh yeah, there you are. I don't know if you're sitting there, but your screen is still open. So, excuse me. You have access to her character analysis of God in the Book of Job, and the joys of ChatGPT. We can ask. Oh, Allison's back. You can share with us the prompt that you use to get that, and people can go back into ChatGPT and tinker with her prompt, right? And so you can like tilt your hand as it relates to it. You could put a couple of other keywords in there. You could put Jewish in there if you wanted to, or you could put Christian in there. You could put it as a, somehow acknowledge that you don't want a pretty picture of God, or you could, again, play with the prompt and you'll get a very different character analysis that'll come from it. But you should look at the one. Allison, throw the prompt in there because I'm curious, because I may play with that if I can't sleep later.
It's
all
in
right.
there.
Oh, it is in there. Okay.
Of course,
Thank you.
yeah.
Now, what I've given you here, and I think we're not going to touch it next week because there's so much Satan stuff, but you have it. And if you actually are interested in it, read it between now and 7 p.m. next Thursday night. And at the beginning, say, wait. Can I ask you about Roman numeral 3 or Roman numeral 4? Oh, see, my numbering's wrong. Roman numeral 3. Roman numeral 4 is a text that everybody knows, but you could say Roman numeral 5. Roman numeral 6. I apologize for what happened is I went back and added the actual biblical text that this stuff is based on, one line from Genesis 22. Where am I? Am I numbering correctly now? Now we're on 8. So you can read these, and if either they don't make sense and you want to ask me about them, or they do make sense and you want me to ask about them, it's totally appropriate. And if we don't do exactly what I think that we're going to do, I thought that we would get to some of this text, but clearly that I'm wrong. As I said, I appended the Psalms here at the bottom as well. These are great texts. All of these texts draw the connection to Abraham. Okay? It's clear if you go back to Job chapter 1. God says, right? I don't think that it uses the word testing anywhere in here. And I don't think it does here. But it clearly is a test. I like the language of wager. So in the Abraham text, Genesis 22, God says, the Torah says, V'Elohim nisa'et Abraham. And God tested Abraham. And so the parallel is going to be there in terms of God testing, and the Midrash, some from Sanhedrin, some from classical Midrashic sources, are going to bring Satan into the testing of Abraham in a number of different ways. So I've brought about a half dozen texts that are there, which I'm happy to look at, read them, see what they are, bring them to shul on Shabbos. I'm happy to sit and have lunch with you. Good night, Allison. Yeah, we're after 8:30, and I promised Bli Neder that we're not going to go past an hour and a half. So you have those texts. It's not my intention to teach them next Thursday, but I will respond to questions about these texts. Either don't bring them to book club tomorrow. Let book club be book club. I don't know if I have to race out afterwards. If you want to ask me at the end of book club tomorrow, I'm happy to, if I have time, I'm happy to do it then. I'm happy to do it Friday night at shul. I'm happy to do it Shabbos morning or Shabbos lunch at shul. And I'm happy to do it next Thursday because it's relevant, even if, I may append those texts to the third. I probably won't. And in fact, now that I think about it, I'm going to delete the Psalms from the bottom of this. If you want to look at the Psalms, you have to go to the first handout, which is still available, and all the rest. But it'll just keep it cleaner if I don't put the same things on the same documents. On different documents. All right, any other questions or comments? All right, again, thank you to Allison for the chat GPT. I will get the video up for those who want to look at it. My contention is every week, I don't know that the class gets better or not. That will be, you'll have your own critique of the classes. I'll have my own critique of them. But Satan will get funkier and funkier and cooler every week as we go through for all 5. That I am confident of. All right, everybody have a good night. Tomorrow the class is at noon, right? It's at noon tomorrow, and services are at 6:15 at the synagogue and on Zoom. Shabbos morning at 9:30. And lots more from there.
Sunday,
Great,
Sunday
thank
movie.
you.
Oh, Sunday is movie night. Sunday is J-Day movie night. Thank you very much.
Great class, Rabbi. Thank you.
Oh, glad.
Very
Good.
nice.
Thank you, everybody
Thank
who
you very much.
participated, who had something to share, and